I have talked about how the Persians had black people amongst their ranks even during the Persian Empire's initial expansion. But we know that they go back even further than this because the people who lived in the Sumerian areas did expand far and wide in terms of knowledge receiving, not colonization necessarily. They didn't go and colonize Egypt, for example, as some people will have you believe, by showing you images that look like Sumerian art. It's not Sumerian art, it's ancient Egyptian art. But in order to substantiate this, what we need is information that black people existed in Persia after the time of Herodotus. Because, of course, I showed you Herodotus and he wrote about it, but a lot of people, I think, were a little bit like, what is he talking about? Why is he mentioning this? Is that not just Indians? I want to show you by looking at something I've already shown in this channel, but I guess people forgot. Ibn Battuta speaks of a coal black man in Persia, and he calls him a Negro. He calls him a coal black Sudan, but obviously I'm going to read the English version where they're going to translate it to Negro. Now, again, before I start reading this, I want to preface by saying this to you guys. Not everyone who went to Persia or India or China or the Middle East or Europe or North Africa who was black was a slave. I've explained this many times, and every time I show you someone who was a slave written down and then converted out of it, this is because of multiple traditions going on in the region, because slavery isn't as what you think it is all over the world as it was in the transatlantic slave trade, where if you're a slave till you die. In some places you could get out. I mean, we've heard about certain people winning their freedoms. In other places, even the selling of humans would make them a slave just by selling, but when you got there, you weren't a slave, you weren't forced to work. But this guy here has nothing to do with slavery at all. As you will see, first of all, he arrived way before Ibn Battuta. His people arrived way before Ibn Battuta. Now, we have to preface this by saying that Ibn Battuta is in the 1200s slash 1300s. This is a long time ago. This is not something, this is almost like 1,000 years ago. So this is not something new. It says here, I was on one occasion at a place called Afkanbar in the district of Hazar Amruha, which is a distance of 5 nights' journey from Delhi, the capital of India. We had encamped there on the river called the River of Al Sari. This was in the season of Shakal, which falls at the time of the summer heats. The river was coming down in flood from the mountains of Karajil. Now everyone who drinks from it, whether man or beast, Now everyone who drinks from it, whether man or beast, dies because of the falling of the rain on poisonous grasses. We stayed by the river for 4 days without anyone going near it. There came to me there a company of poor brethren who had iron rings on their necks and arms, and whose chief was a coal black Negro. Stop right there. Their chief was a coal black Negro, not just anyone, their chief. And he calls him coal black, which means, first of all, he doesn't even describe the people of West Africa as coal black, which tells you how much different this is. This is probably a guy from Sudan. And then he calls him a Negro, which in the original would be the word Sudan. They belong to the, which by the way, Sudan isn't necessarily the translation of Negro, because of course the people of the Zanj would not be called Sudan, and certain other people who are black, even some Egyptians, would not be called Sudan, while some others would be. They belong to the corporation known as the Hyderaria, and they spent one night with us. Their chief asked me to supply him with a firewood. They belong to the corporation known as the Hadria, and they spent one night with us. Their chief asked me to supply them with firewood, that they might light it for their dance. So I charged the governor of that district, who was Aziz, known as Al Qamar, an account of him will be given later, to furnish it. He sent about 10 loads of it, and after the night prayer they kindled it, and at length, when it was a mass of glowing coals, they began their musical recital, and went into that fire, still dancing and rolling about in it. Their chief asked me for a shirt, and I gave him one, of the finest texture. He put it on, and he began to roll about in the fire with it on, and to beat the fire with the sleeves until it was extinguished and dead. He then brought me the shirt, showing not a single trace of burning on it, at which I was greatly astonished. Like I said, I've mentioned the story before, but it's still a very interesting one nonetheless. And the reason why I would mention the story again is because of what I just said about Herodotus mentioning that there were Negroes that were posted in Persia next to the Indian lands. And you can see there, this guy is fully aware of Indians. In fact, not only is he aware of Indians, he separates smaller faction of Indians. For examples, the ones that live in Ceylon, which is today called Sri Lanka, he makes a big difference between them and the Indians of mainland India. So this guy is not a stupid person. He knows the differences between these people. And when he says a coal-black Negro, he's not saying that these were people that were kind of like Negroes, but maybe they kind of sort of. And I know there's this thing where we like pretend that people in the past were stupid. So when they say Negro, maybe they didn't really mean Negro. They just were like confused about what a Negro. No, everything here is precise, known, and factual. And of course, if I go back to Africa, where he started writing about, he starts describing places. And I know I've mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again. He starts describing places that are Negro areas. And he starts with Morocco as a Negro area. Some parts of Morocco, he describes them. He says, I'm going to the place where there's Negroes, and he starts with Morocco. Then he goes to Iwalatan, or Litan, which is Mauritania. And then from Mauritania, he goes to the salt mines that stand between North Africa and West Africa, which used to be used by the Malians. And then he carries on from there to Chad, from Chad to Egypt, and from Egypt to Ethiopia and the Zand regions, describing all of that as black African regions. Why does this matter? Well, it's because you must understand the difference between him describing the lands as belonging to the blacks versus him saying that there are black people in those areas. This is two different things. I want to make sure I state it because I've already stated before in a previous video that if 40 black people go to Australia and live amongst the native Australians, perhaps even bringing some new technology there, it doesn't make the Australian civilization suddenly African, because the people in control of it, who still run the place, who still live there, the majority population is still Australian. And that's how claim or ownership of places has always worked. If you bring an invention to a land, means that you now can claim ownership of that land. That means that the Europeans can, well, let's pick just one form of invention, because Europeans took a lot of invention from around the world, as did many other people. That means the compass, the gun, gunpowder, certain maps, certain writing skills. A lot of those came from China. So like I guess Britain is a Chinese civilization. That's not how it works. Even if you brought technology to that region, it means nothing. Now, given that certain preface, now we can look into what other people lived amongst black people. Because I know some people like to say the Berbers, they have nothing to do, the white Berbers have nothing to do with the black Berbers, and no, blah, 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 and the cultures have nothing to do with each other, and blah, blah, blah. We'll look at two things that will point that that's just obviously not true. It's not true. The white Berbers and the black Berbers, they at least in the time of this guy, they had similar cultural things, which the white Berbers took from the black Berbers, obviously. And we know this because people who are not Berbers share very similar cultures to the people who are Berbers, from Afro-Asiatic languages to the customs, just general African customs. But we'll come back to that. We'll read this part. Condiments of dinners or dirhams, but only pieces of salt, glass, trinkets, which people call nazm, and some articles of perfume. Among these, they prefer cloves, mastic, which is their incense. When he arrives at a village, the black women come with anli, curds, chickens, flour of nabak, rice, funi, which is like mustard seed, and from which they make all those things, bean flour. He buys what he wants of these, but eating the rice is bad for white people. Funi is better. After traveling for 10 days from Iwalatan, remember where that is, we reached the village of Zagari, which is a big village inhabited by black merchants called Wanjarata. Along with them live a number of white people who belong to the Ibadi sect of the Khariji and are called Saganagu. The Sunni Malikas among the whites are called Turis among them. From this village Anli is imported to Iwalatan. We left Zagari and reached the great river, the Nile, on which is the two of Kursaku. The Nile descends from there to Kabara and then to Zaga. In Kabara and Zaga are two sultans who obey the king of Mali. The people of Zaga adopted Islam long time ago. Well, if the people who lived in these areas were dark-skinned Moors, where do these white people come from? Why are there white people who copy and mimic the styles of these people? Well, that's an obvious answer, the Romans. The Romans and the Phoenicians and all these other groups that stationed themselves in these areas and then adopted the cultures, especially with the spin-off or the shoot-off of the Romans. But let's go to another century in the Kingdom of Congo in order to substantiate something I said a long time ago, which is that the dances of Africa are the same as that of the Moors, which is the same generally as those of North Africa. And if the dances of North Africa are similar to that or the same as that of the rest of Africa, whether or not you think that the ancient Egyptians are just another version of Moors or the sub Saharan Africans, it's safe to say that the Egyptians must have danced like Africans because all of them dance in this way without the introduction of foreign dances at the time of the Arabs, which you can see some belly dancing and stuff like that, which comes from India. So we read here from a report of the Kingdom of Congo in the 1500s. Keep that in mind. So this is about 200 years after Ibn Battuta. They also dance and clap their hands together in time with the music. Pipes and flutes are also played with great skill at the king's court, whilst the people dance somewhat in a Moorish fashion, with gravity and dignity. The common people use little rattles and pipes and similar instruments, which are harsher and ruder in sound than those used by the nobles. They also dance and clap their hands together in time with the music. Pipes and flutes are also played with great skill at the king's court, whilst the people dance somewhat in a Moorish fashion, with gravity and dignity. The common people use little rattles and pipes and similar instruments, which are harsher and ruder in sound than those used by the nobles. This is also confirmed by the fact that we have images from ancient Egypt that show these women giving African praise hands in the air with stomping. You can see there the legs are barely lifted off the ground, and this next image, the legs barely lifted off the ground. And they do this often and always in their images. You can see that this is a typical thing, especially done by females, which of course dancing in Africa is usually done by females, and then obviously the men are skilled with it as well. We then pass to something else where Ibn Battuta himself could have been mixed or black, because there's no real physical description, even though his books are so long, of himself. Now, there is some parts that speak about his hair and stuff like that. Ibn Battuta is from a specific area of North Africa, which he himself described as having black Africans. And so it cannot be completely ruled out that he himself was a black African. By the way, I'm still admiring these images of Egyptians dancing, because almost everything about it, if you didn't know there was a debate about what the Egyptians look like, you would just be like, wow, what a fantastic African civilization. I didn't know that they cared so much about themselves to depict themselves like this. But because there's a debate, for some reason we have to pretend that these images do not reflect Africa proper. Of course, given the fact that Ibn Battuta is from Africa, the first place he talks about is Africa, and he talks about it in deep detail. For example, if we take this one piece about him in Egypt, he says, I arrived at length at the city of Misr, mother of cities, and seat of Pharaoh the tyrant. This is from the Bible. Mistress of broad provinces and faithful lands, boundless in multitudes of buildings, peerless in beauty and splendor, the meeting place of comer and goer, the stopping place of feeble and strong. Therein is what you will of learned and simple, grave and gay, prudent and foolish, base and noble, of high estate and low estate, unknown and famous. She surges as the waves of the sea with her throngs of folk, and can scarce contain them for all the capacity of her situation and sustaining power. Her youth is ever new in spite of length of days, and the star of her horoscope does not move from the mansion of fortune. Her conquering capital, Al Kahira, has subdued the nations, and her kings have grasped the forelocks of both Arab and non Arab. She has her peculiar possession, the majestic Nile, which dispenses her district from the need of entreating the distillation. Her territory is a month's journey for a hastened traveler of generous soil, and extending a friendly welcome to strangers. I think it's fair to say that Ibn Battuta was a fan of Egypt. And this must have made him very proud, given the fact that he himself is from Africa, the continent of Africa, and he has this thing that he can easily get access to. And I mean, in this book, he talks extensively about the people who lived in the regions at his time, and even the Buja or the Beja people. Remember, even though Africans were traveling all the way to Persia at this time, And you notice that earlier I mentioned that there was a safety between even the white populations of North Africa and the black populations. This also meant that people from Persia came to Egypt, as we will read in this part. The convents, too, are numerous. The people there call them Kawanik, the singular being Kanka, and the emirs in Cairo vie with one another in building them. Each convent in Cairo is affected to the use of a separate congregation of poor brethren, most of whom are Persians, men of good education and adepts in the way of Sufism. Each has a sheikh and a warden, and the organization of their affairs is admirable. Again, Persians living in Egypt and Sudanese living in Persia. The world was up and down. This is why in 1001 Nights you find stories that have multiple races in the stories. Like the story of Aladdin has Indians in it, it has black Africans in it, it has North Africans in it of the lighter skin, and it also has people of the Middle East. It has a bunch of people all over. The Persians as well. Let me not forget that. It has that inside their stories. Jafar, I think in the original, is a North African, but you don't they don't mention that on Disney. You have to go read the original books. Okay, good. Now that I've mentioned Sufism, let's go and talk about Sufism. So Sufism was founded earlier than Zulnun al-Misri, but Zulnun al-Misri is one of the early saints of Sufism, and he is a Nubian who was there in the same places that these Persians are. So remember, Persians and Nubians didn't hate each other. Zanj and all these people didn't hate each other. Slavery at this time was not racial. There was slavery, but it was not racial. And even if you were taken as a slave, one or two generations later, your children would be set free because it wasn't racial. It wasn't you're born a slave, you die a slave, your children will be slaves because it's all about your race. Your slavery would be limited to you. But remember, Islam is not a foreign thing to Africa necessarily, in the sense that there's still that Ethiopian woman who, in the beginning, Ayman, in the beginning, who was there before Muhammad was even born, peace be upon him, was even born. Remember that that Ethiopian woman who took care of him, and he was a second mother. She was a second mother to Muhammad. And then there's the many converts of Somalian and Ethiopian people who basically were some of the early founders and some of the early most important people in Islam. So when I talk about Mali and its Islamic history, don't look at the Islam as if it's some foreign concept to Africa. It was one of the earliest captured things in Africa. Remember also Christianity is not foreign to Africa. It was literally formed in Egyptian Africa. Islam was not formed in Africa, but it's not foreign. It's not something where it was formed without black people, as if like it just came out of nowhere. And by the way, the Arabic script, black people were around when it was being invented. So don't look at the Arabic script like it's something foreign to black Africans as well. We were in the Middle East, and as it was being formed, we were there as part of its formation. And do not look at Arabic script, and do not look at the Sabaean script. Do not look at any of these scripts from the Middle East outside of some, very far ones, Elam or something, as outside of African script. Forget the fact that it's traceable to Egyptian for now. I'm talking about just the fact that Africans were in those regions. And how do we know? Because we have the history written by the early Mohammedans. The early Mohammedans wrote about how Muhammad was one of the dudes who, in fact, Muhammad himself praised one of his main people, who was this female Ayman, who was a great follower and fought with him in a war. She showed non cowardness and she even outlasted him. She was a worker for his family, and Muhammad even wrote a letter saying that anyone who would marry this Ethiopian woman would be blessed because this woman is a true woman. And two of her sons would end up being very famous in Islam. And this is the very beginnings of Islam. And remember that Arabic was consolidated. Remember that people didn't all speak Arabic, and it was consolidated by the people of the golden age of Islam because, of course, they wanted to understand what was going on in their entire kingdom when they were colonizing. And so there were other languages. Remember, there were other languages all over the place with different scripts. But keep in mind that before that happened, during the time of Muhammad, there were black people around and very close to Muhammad. Baraka was an Abyssinian slave who protected Muhammad during the death of his mother and father. She was raised by the parents of Muhammad as a slave doing their duties. And so, when their parents died, she became Muhammad's property. She is known by a lot of names, but one of the ones that Muhammad gave her was my mother after my mother, because she raised, and in raising him, she was one of his first followers. She was told by the grandfather of Muhammad not to leave his side, and so that's what she did, especially since it had been predicted that he would be the prophet of the nation. She was constantly at the side of Muhammad, and when Muhammad was 7 years old, she 100% had responsibility for him. But when Muhammad grew up and married Khadija, she was set free by Muhammad, and so she was no longer charged as a slave, but yet refused to leave his side, even refusing to marry. But of course, Muhammad said that she's not getting any younger and it's important for her to get married. And so Muhammad found a suitor and she married him. The suitor later died and she remarried. Interestingly, she married Muhammad's adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, who, by the way, was way younger than her. And the reason why this man married her is because Muhammad said, to know Baraka is to know heaven. And of course, Zayd ibn Haritha wanted to know heaven, so why wouldn't he marry her? All of that information already makes her part of a legendary story, but what really made her legendary is that she was present at the Battle of Uhud, where she fetched water for the soldiers and helped treat their injuries, acting as a full woman and taking care of them. But in the Battle of Uhud, when things were going bad, many of the men who were in Muhammad's army ran away because they thought that Muhammad was dead. Ayman, who was tasked with being by the side of Muhammad at all times, took a sword and ran towards the battlefield with several women to go fight the enemy. Though she was injured, she did not die there. In fact, she outlived Muhammad by several years, only dying later during the caliphate of Abu Bakr. This shows that Ethiopians and other Africans have always been intertwined with the history of the Middle East, even though we did not need to go to Islam, because Islam is one of the later empires in which you see Abyssinians. Abyssinians have always been present in the Middle East, and some of the earliest evidence comes from people like Xerxes, who depict Abyssinians in his empire, and in fact, he calls them one of the strongest parts of his army. If we take all of this information and we drive it in a non religious direction to talk about how some black people were treated in that area, starting, of course, with slaves and then free men, what we see is the stereotype of the wretched African is something that was built later, not before Islam. This woman is mentioned in many hadiths, and she is mentioned by other historical accounts, making her reality quite real. In the future, lots of other Ethiopians were mentioned as well as non Ethiopians. And so the story unfolds that you don't get Islam without an Ethiopian woman. So, in conclusion, what is my point here? My point is the African networks stretch far and wide in the world, and they have been around for a long time. And the reason why we have to pay attention, open your eyes and look, and do not sway your head left and right, trying to isolate Africans into Africa so that you can feel comfortable about it. It is not going to happen. Africans have been traveling the world for a very long time. And not only that, they had various roles in kingdoms all over the world. They played such important role. I mean, literally, the creation of Islam, they played a role there. The creation of Christianity, they played a role there, a big role. I mean, probably the biggest. The fact that Christianity is taken from Islam. They also played a giant role in the Judeo religion. They also played a giant role in the Middle Ages, because people like to pretend there was no Middle Ages, that there was no black people in the Middle Ages. They were all over the place. There's even people who are Negroes who are during and right after the time of Leonardo da Vinci, artists. There's all kinds of people. By the way, I need to show you that artist, that Moorish artist who was known to be a Moor, and he was painted as black, and he painted other people who weren't black. But we'll talk about that another day. And keep in mind, oh yeah, I was going to say something about the dances of the people. You will find that the gypsies in Roma, in Rome, and other places around that area in Spain and all the places, they have dances that are similar to that of the Africans. That's stomping and clapping your hands, and almost like gumboot dancing, almost like tapping, percussion dancing. Now, you do not find this in India, and we know that the gypsies are from India. So how do we know what's going on here? We know that what's going on is because we know what's going on because they're being influenced by these Africans taking these dances, because they almost have nothing in common with the Indians in terms of their historicals. And of course, like I said, the Africans affected the entire Middle East. If you look up Dabke, the dance of Dabke, you will notice that instantly it rings as African. The music is like African. There's even historical people who write. Remember, the books in Islam are numerous. They're not small, and they speak of music, they speak of dance, they speak of literature, art, all of this stuff. And almost nowhere will you find no Negroes. In fact, one of the biggest one where you'll find a bunch of Negroes if you want it is law. Remember Al-Zanj, who was a lawyer in Egypt? And of course, you know that Al-Zanj, the last names of these people have to do with where they are. Then there's Al-Misr, who was a black person. And of course, Al-Misri, Zulnun Al-Misri, who was a Nubian. We have all of these just stacked up one after the other. And then, of course, Al-Timbuktu, um, Al, I forgot now. But we have all these people. I hate the fact that I love the fact that they put their names at the end, but I hate the fact that they didn't just say the race of the person, because there's always enough doubt for some people to like, oh, he might be called Al Zanj, but maybe it was a Persian guy from the Zanj region. And it's like, oh my God, there's always going to be some naysayer somewhere. But like I said, all we have to pay attention to ourselves is the fact that, because people look for this type of expansion around the world and how black people were responsible for things going on outside of Africa. And I can show you real examples. And even the possibility, like if you want to look at the Moors who possibly went to the Americas, you're not going to be able to do it without focusing on the Islamic expansions, because they talk about stuff like that. Whether it's fiction or fact, it doesn't matter. They talk about it. And I want you guys to like the video. I want to show that the thing about the Americas and the island on the other side. I've talked about it before, but I want to talk about it. I mean, if I get 100 likes, maybe I should talk about that. But maybe I should just stick to Africa and maybe even Oceania, because I still want to talk about Oceania. I feel like the people over there have been abandoned, and the fact that we just find writing in the middle of Easter Island for no reason. Anyway, the conclusion is that Africans are everywhere. And I want to say the dude that is black as charcoal in that region, do not take that guy as an exception. He came with a tribe of people. And also, I think it's very telling the fact that he came across as a poor person, that it's not just some king. Well, they said he was the chief of those people, but it's not some king who can afford to go there or whatever. This is a guy who's been there for a while. And this guy did not even give a place of birth, by the way. Ibn Battuta, of that guy, he didn't say he was born somewhere else. He just said he was a Persian guy. Remember that. So Herodotus is being confirmed here. He's one of the most well written people in history. And I'm glad that they got rid of this old thing they used to do where they used to call him the father of lies. Remember that old thing? Whenever they want, every time they were like, he said black people did something, they called him the father of lies, but that's gone now. And of course, I actually checked some thing where they were saying that Cleopatra might have been black, but I'm not going to talk about that. And then they were talking about that other guy from North Africa, the people like Hannibal and all that. And again, I'm not going to talk about any of those things yet, because we need more evidence to be gathered.